Thank you again, everyone, for being here. Thank you to Sunny and Felix for drawing together this wonderful group of people. I want to frame this final panel, which is going to close with a roundtable discussion. We're all going to be able to face each other and talk together at the end of this part of the day. I want to start by invoking the question that was raised by Eric Crew, who was the young man sitting up here, the very first question posed at the beginning of the day when he asked about the production and navigation of power relations around the production of knowledge. So I want to invite us to sort of think about this panel on remedies and strategies, next steps, how we move forward, to engage in a little bit of Bourdieusian epistemic reflexivity with both a kind of circumspect attitude, which is appropriate post 11/9/2016, but also some celebration. So in terms of circumspection, there's really not a lot that needs to be said, and I can say it very quickly, just drawing forth some of the themes that have already been touched on. We are living in a time of new but not new, resurgent white supremacy. From the U.S. historical perspective, this is familiar to us. We've seen it before. It's neo-redemptionism. We saw it post-Reconstruction. Neo-nationalism, nativism with an attendant misogyny, anti-intellectualism descending into a kind of anti-facticity, attacks on norms of public discourse, attacks on the rule of law, all merging toward a more efficient, effective, and extractive autocracy or kleptocracy, depending on how you want to view it. And all that is combining with, interwoven with resurgent neoliberalism, as was mentioned, but I think it's worth mentioning also that there is a distinctive libertarian strain that is very effective here, and we ought not to underestimate the impact of methodological individualism as a strategy. Commitments to austerity and precarity, government bad, private good, as was mentioned, discussed beautifully during the keynote. All of these factors coming together to reinscribe and reinforce existing intersectional hierarchies around identity. And the concentration of capital, and again, as we were helped to see during the keynote, the capitalization and ownership of debt as capital, the concentration of capital in fewer and whiter hands. So all those are reasons to be circumspect about what can be done. Systems are recalcitrant, they're resilient. And in my own field of criminal law, I'll just take a moment of privilege to share one tiny story, an example of that. When the Supreme Court ruled in the McCleskey case that the Eighth Amendment Cruel and Unusual Punishment Clause will not recognize statistical data to support a claim of disparate racial impact in sentencing, that led to a fair amount of despair and wheel spinning for a lot of years in terms of the obvious disproportionalities around criminal legal systems and case outcomes. In the state where I was working, North Carolina, we gathered together in a social movement to try, as an end run to the multiple disasters involved in capital punishment systems, to enact a moratorium on executions as a sort of a backstop approach to abolition. And we came within one vote of winning that. And lost. And as part of the political negotiation around that, what North Carolina got was the Racial Justice Act, which was the first legislation in the nation to allow the use of statistical evidence to prove race discrimination through disparate impact or intentional race discrimination in capital sentencing. And with the help of some brilliant folks at Michigan State University's law school and some evidence that prosecutors had buried in their files, a judge found, based on an exhaustive hearing and fact pattern, that the entire state's capital system was infected with intentional race discrimination, and therefore existing death sentences should be vacated. That lasted about a minute. Fell prey to severe whitelash, and the act was gutted. So the fight now is over whether there's a double jeopardy bar to putting the guys that got off death row back on death row. So this is just an example of the reactionaryism, the resilience of these systems in the face of advocacy. But we have so much to celebrate. And in gathering these folks here together in this final panel, I think they're distinctively able to provide a foundation for the discussion that we will then have together about next steps. And what I would invite us to think about is, as researchers, how we can use our power and privilege, how we can come together and acknowledge the assets that we have, that we are able to employ to serve justice. And I'm especially interested just personally in hearing thoughts about theory, the theories that you see as most viable, as maybe the new theories that need to be created, of method. I want to give a shout out to Angela's call for engaged, collaborative research, working with the people who have the wisdom on the ground about what's really happening and hearing their voices. A transdisciplinary approach to research that not only bridges gaps between academic disciplines, but also breaks down the subject-object dichotomy. So with those brief remarks, a little longer than they should have been, we'll look forward to hearing from our three panelists at this point: Lena Petrovich, Gregor Fisher, and Eddie Bruce Jones. Remedies and strategies. Tell us what they are.
You go, man. Hi, everyone. There's a clicker. Okay, I think I know how that works. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me from London to get out of the dreary weather and to come to this summer paradise in Ohio. And I'm really excited to be among colleagues, some new to me, some whom I've read for years and delighted to meet, and some old friends. So this is great. I'm just going to cut right to it. I don't know if the remedies that I'm going to talk about are legal ones, but I think that's part of the interrogation that I'm involved with anyway in interacting with my interlocutors, who have been, by and large, non-legal actors. In one particular case that I've been looking at for the past 13 years now, well, I've been looking at it more, maybe 11 years, but it's a case of a death in custody of a man who died in a police cell in Dessau, in a former East German city, in 2005, and his name was Jello. And through looking at this case as a legal student then, and then now a law professor, as a trial observer then, and now a member of an independent commission that was put together to basically shadow the legal fallout from the trial. And just as a person who's trained in anthropology and really wants to get to the heart of what types of discussions are being had outside of the courtroom as well as inside of the courtroom, it's been a real journey for me, this case. And it's opened up different ways of looking at how race and the law intersect in Germany from my perspective. So it's not a very doctrinal work, and I'm basically talking about the book that I wrote mainly about the case, but then really about the context in which the case unravels. That's been a real exercise, and it continues to be a real exercise in challenging me to look at my role as a law academic, but also the role of law in helping us to find justice or solutions to things that actually are much more than legal, and therefore require much more than legal remedies. Just to give you a few ideas about, there we go, where I'm coming from, very quickly. For me, law has the potential to also integrate anthropological methods, but that's mostly because of critical race theory, and it's because of looking at law not as a circular, closed system where you're asking legal questions for legal answers and that's where it ends, but rather interrogating law as an institution, looking at how power operates within law and how law actually produces race and produces forms of domination, and it supports those forms. So for me, I look at anthropological methodology and I look at law as having a methodology. It's usually written off as not having methodology, but I think it's full of potential for various approaches. And I see them as in different spheres because I'm located in a law school and I have to kind of justify my methods to my faculty, but I look at them as highly interrelated, especially if you start from the point that you're not asking a closed legal question. If you're asking a question about how case law should be interpreted by a court, I think then many of these methods aren't going to be available in terms of what might happen in terms of for a certain outcome. But if you're interested in what should happen, or if you're interested in what else is going on to produce this institution's response to a certain issue, then anthropological methodologies, including looking at non-legal actors' ideas, interrogating what the purpose or the remedies, multiple remedies are from a certain litigation, then you're already doing work that requires more social science input. So I don't see them as completely separate. I just want to spend 2 minutes talking about the Jello case before I get into how activists and legal actors have responded to the case. So Jello was a man who was on a Duldung. We learned what a Duldung was in a film that we watched yesterday, but it's basically a certain type of residency permission, but as Matthias pointed out earlier during one of the breaks, Duldung actually means toleration. It means you're being tolerated in the country on a very short-term basis, which needs to be reviewed constantly, and then you're going to be asked to leave if anything goes wrong. And this status is what he was on because his asylum claim had been rejected, and he was in the process of figuring out what comes next. He was living in Dessau. He had a community there. A lot of the community was made of people who were also going through the immigration process, the asylum process, and people who just lived in Dessau. So one night he wasn't heard from, and then the next day no one heard from him, and then people in his community heard that there was someone who died in a police station, the Dessau police station. And it turns out there was a man who was chained to the bed, that was later came out in the details of the case, chained to the bed by his wrists and ankles and was burned to death. So then they found out that it was him. So it was their friend. So basically, the police didn't make the body available right away. They did a forensic autopsy. It didn't find anything inconsistent with the police's argument that he did this to himself. And the family and friends really wanted to see the body. Once they saw the body, they said, no, this has not happened the way you described. The man was burned to charcoal, more or less. So they ripped open the box that he was to be buried in at a funeral service. And they said, this is what they did to him. We have to find out what happened. So they commissioned, through raising money in the community, a second autopsy, which found broken nose and a burst eardrum. And they pursued it. They pursued it through adding the family to the litigation of the prosecutor. So the prosecutor brought charges, because it had hit the media by then, the prosecutor brought charges of negligence against the police, but didn't bring charges of anything more than that. So presumed that he'd burned himself with a lighter while cuffed by his ankles and wrists to the bed. And the family, in Germany, the family doesn't have the right to a civil case outside of the criminal case and can't direct the charges in the criminal case because that's up to the prosecutor. So since 2005, there have been no murder charges or anything close to manslaughter or anything like that brought against the police. So there was one case, the first case the police were acquitted, that was appealed. In the appeal case, which I observed from 2009 to 2012, the police were fined. They were fined 10,000 euros for not rescuing him quickly enough and for not, taking due care to have him not burn himself to death. So the narrative of the police has been the whole time that he must have hidden a lighter, and there are lots of details to go into, but he must have hidden a lighter in his body or somewhere because they checked him. And he must have ripped open the fireproof mattress with one hand and set it alight and then burned to that degree within a few minutes. The activists the whole time have been they've not been taking that as what happened. So there are a lot of things to consider in this case. In the Q&A, we can, or later over drinks, we can talk about the missing evidence. So the forensics footage was cut off after a couple of minutes. The cameras were pointed in the wrong direction. There was a water hose nearby the cell, but that wasn't seen as any relevant point of the investigation against the police. And the smoke alarms went off and the police turned them off, but they said that they'd been malfunctioning. So all of these things add up to this mystical, magical situation in which all of these things converged on the police still not having any real responsibility for actively participating in the person's death. So that's kind of the background of the case. So what happens when this absurd situation is basically passed through the court system with a slap on the wrist, which is a fine that the police office just take care of? One thing that's in the background is the lack of language around talking about institutional forms of discrimination. So racism was never an explicit part of this case. It still isn't as part of the case formally under law, but in the media, it's become a huge part of the case. Most obviously because this is a black man with insecure immigration status, and what would have happened if it would have been a white German citizen who burned to charcoal while in the prison cell. So institutional racism is, this language is borrowed from the McPherson report, which came out after a young man was beat to death by neo-Nazis, young black man, in London. And the police were investigated for not following up properly. So they basically blamed the best friend, they blamed him for being in the wrong place, and they didn't service the family's needs appropriately. And the language of institutional racism was helpful for activists in Germany trying to get to the heart of what they could then articulate was wrong with the processing of this case. But that only went so far because it doesn't really have traction in the German context. And my colleagues can probably attest to this with various other types of examples. But institutional racism is not featuring in the way that this is being analyzed, definitely not in the courtrooms, but even outside of the courtrooms, that's an uphill climb. Occupying the court, though, as a scene for making these types of statements has been really important for the activists. So keeping the trial going keeps light on the trial, but it also enables the discussions that happen within the courtroom to be heard elsewhere. It's also an important point of being able to engage with the institutions of law on an ongoing basis while other people are potentially being killed. So in 2011, and this was during the appellate trial, another woman was killed by police, a black woman, Nigerian German woman in Frankfurt, and she was shot in the stomach fatally when she went to a job center and got into an argument with one of the people who worked in the job center because she was asking for her payment. And she had a knife, and the police say that she had to brandish this knife with a crazy look in her eyes. And so they shot her in the stomach, and she died. And so her story had been picked up during the course of activist mobilization on the Jello case, and it became a part of the same story. And part of another footnote to all of this is, like in other countries in Europe, and particularly in France, there is not a lot of data that's publicly available on who dies in custody, what the population of, for example, black people is that die in police custody. So there's a difficult way to articulate the patterns of black death in policing institutions or any other institutions in Germany. But the activists have also been linked in with other groups that are working on similar issues. I'm just going to skip ahead because I'm really running short of time. And part of what they've done is created a set of images that speak to one another and articulate the pattern through the visuals. So demonstrating and taking to the streets is a very big form of activism in Germany. And because these figures are recognizable in various ways, so the one in the middle is named Usman Sey, and he was shackled by police in 2012 while having some sort of episode, a mental health episode, and he had a cardiac arrest and ended up dying in the police, I think he died in the police cell or he died shortly thereafter. And Uri Jallo's all the way on the left. And there are various others. So in the book that I wrote, I listed 11 different deaths that were all brought into the same narrative, and many of them had posters in yellow and black that were made to basically educate the public on what was happening. So in terms of remedies, and I know remedies is the point of this long kind of thing, is that public pedagogy has been one of the main aims, I think, of this whole process, because the outcome looks pretty dire. The next step legally might be to go to the European Court of Human Rights and to try to argue that Uri Jallo's life was taken away and there was a violation of Article 2 because it should have been, of the European Convention on Human Rights, because it should have been preserved. But in terms of what the aims for German society are, it's educating German society about the pattern of racist abuse among the police, but also about, thank you, but also about how difficult it is to tell the stories. Another remedy is around the structures that basically make it difficult for the evidence to be heard properly. So there is no inquest procedure in Germany like exists in the UK, and there are various things that can be invoked in France, but it's not very easy. In Germany, the prosecutor has the power, really, and there is no independent coroner's procedure where a death in custody is investigated by a matter of course. There was no questioning about the physics of whether this was even possible for this person to be burned without lighter fluid, so the activists took it upon themselves to commission a fire expert to create a similar scenario. Of course, that's not going to be admissible in court, but it was very important to have a press conference where this evidence was shown on video, and that's what the fire is that's burning. Prosecutors be invited, and there'd be public pressure for there to be a reopening of the case, which it actually did achieve. But all that teaches us is that it's a do-it-yourself kind of system where you're just, if you can raise the money, you can create the public pressure to have the courts move, which is a really unfortunate thing. But part of, I think, the aim of the activist work has been to show that this is necessary and there needs to be some sort of structural change. And it ties in, and there's so much more to say, with what others had talked about the connections between colonialism and racism today. And I'll just end with this. During all of this, in the background, there's also movements to recognize the place of colonialism and the contemporary manifestations of that in everyday life in Germany. And so activists from the Initiative Schwarze Deutsche and ADEFRA and activists in the black community and others got the name changed of one of the streets that was previously dedicated to basically a colonial German figure, to Mai Ayim, who was the poet, a really important poet and political activist in the black German community. And that was an important breakthrough because it's really about public education and recognition that there is something to talk about, that colonialism has a huge place in Germany, and also structural racism has a really huge place in Germany. So many of the same activists were also involved in cases like the Uri Jello case. Thanks.
I'm gonna remain seated here. I also want to thank the organizers for inviting me, for organizing this wonderful setting here, and for all the thought-provoking presentations that came before mine and that I'm sure I cannot live up to, but I'm going to try to tell you something about the inclusion of Roma in European societies. Yesterday, I gave a lecture on the EU policy in this domain, and it was kind of depressing in the end for all the students that were listening. So I have a bit reframed the narrative here. And I'm going to start on a dark note. When in 1946, after the Holocaust, the surviving 10% of Austria's Roma population came back to Burgenland, which is at the most eastern part of Austria, one police station sent a formal letter to the Ministry of the Interior asking where all this gypsy mayhem was again coming from, because they had thought that the Gypsies had been done with in Austria. So that's where Roma in Austria had to start after being almost exterminated in the Holocaust. As you might imagine, when coming back under such circumstances, it's not easy to get back into your normal life, and it's even harder when you bear in mind what they saw when they came back to the villages, because new houses had been built there in the meantime, and there were no records whatsoever of Romani settlements being there. So new settlements outside of small towns and villages of Burgenland were built, and they ended up as ghettos. So for years there was also school segregation in Austria, the same that we see today in Slovakia and Hungary, until the 70s, where the Romani movement started, and there were also non-Romani people helping there to empower the communities. And finally, in the 90s, Roma were recognized as an Austrian minority. So you could say one mission was accomplished there, because what that meant was there was political representation for Romani persons in Austria, there was guaranteed funding for initiatives, and there was a kind of being reintegrated in Austrian society after almost having been exterminated. In the years prior to that, Roma could also be recognized as a victim group, which was not of the Holocaust, which was not the case in the beginning, where only Jews were paid reparations by the Austrian state. So what happened then? You have now this autochthonous Romani community in Austria that is recognized by the state. And then you have the others. So at the moment when Austria finally recognized its own Roma, race moved on to the next outsiders. A new outsider group was constructed. And about at the same time, Austria acceded to the European Union. So we had then the Schengen room where borders were opened, and some years after, you had those gypsies sitting in the street again. That's what the mass media said. So as Austrian Roma were not targeted by that directly, but that term was known to them. When you talk to representatives today, they say they feel as representatives of all Roma in Austria. But the constitutional law in this respect says something totally different. So Austrian national law has played its part in again constructing the outsider gypsy, as opposed to the Austrian Roma, the sedentary population that has always been there. And when you look for case law regarding minority rights in Austria, there is practically none that says how many generations you have to be settling in Austria to be seen as an Austrian minority. But scholars say about 100 years or so would be sufficient. Why that is, I have read a lot of articles about that, but none could convince me that that number has to say anything. And it got passed on from scholar to scholar to scholar. In the end, for me, it's null and void also in legal terms. And there hasn't been a case in front of the Constitutional Court where that could have been really proven. So let's see what happens. There are some minorities in Austria that could be eligible, in my point of view, which would be the Polish population in Vienna, but also Romani groups that have not been recognized in 1995. They could file they cannot file for such a procedure in front of the Constitutional Court without good reasons, without being personally affected. So that would be really a construction of a case, but I have not seen anything like that being planned. So what happened in the meantime on the international level or at the European level, you would say? In 1969, the Council of Europe, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, issued a statement saying that it was necessary to integrate the Gypsies in modern European societies. So you see, the language alone points in the direction where they come from. Modern societies on the one side and Gypsies on the other. And this language remained in official policy documents at least until the mid of the 1990s. You can read the same from the European Parliament that is now driving Roma inclusion by the means of EU Roma policy. Which is also why some have called the EU Roma policy a token policy. And when the EU talks about Roma as untapped labor, then you can see that the European single market is a capitalist project, first, and second, that there is no real basis for the strategy of 2011, the framework that the Commission proposed, that is grounded in human rights or in fundamental freedoms of the European Union, but rather in a single market that should function and where you don't need beggars in the streets keeping you or holding you back in progress. So it is also a intrinsically modernist project. Then when you say, when I think about how this policy is informed, I don't know, Angela, how often has the Commission called you? Yeah. Yeah. But when you say 2011 was the framework, the introduction of the framework, since then I think no calls, right? No. Yeah. That's what I figured, because there are public consultations and there are studies, but then in the end, when it comes to modernizing the policy itself, not much movement there since 2013 when the European Council issued a recommendation. And this is all legally non-binding. So we are in a legal vacuum in a way that is only of value when the member states could really be motivated by EU funds to do something for Roma. But that is also not the case, and billions of euros have vanished somewhere. We don't know. So what to do about that? And then there we come to the remedies. I told you the story of Austria, not because I think that Austrian Roma people are in a particularly good situation. There's nothing more to do for or with them, because the racism in Austrian society could easily again target them also. That's not the case. At the moment, the favorite victims of Austrian racism are not the Gypsies anymore, but refugees. But from one day to the other, if some politician decides that this would be a good group to single out, then also Austrian Roma, or Gypsies as those politicians would call them, could be the target again. So what we need is to reinforce the existing networks of Romani and pro-Romani NGOs in Europe, because this is not a national thing anymore as the Austrian recognition of Roma as a minority, and to re-evaluate how EU funding is spent, because the people I've met, those lawyers doing pro bono work for Roma, they would be in an excellent position to drive the cases forward. At the moment, there's the European Roma Rights Center in Budapest that's also doing excellent work. Why not move funds there? Because in the end, that could be a way of transforming the soft law instruments into hard law by getting the cases in front of the Court of Justice of the European Union, but also in front of the European Courts of Human Rights. So there are these competent persons, and you don't have to search for them anymore. You just have to walk up to them and ask them. And I don't think that they would have anything against getting paid for their awesome work that they do. So that would be the access to justice. What's more there, as experts from Austria have told me, what would be really helpful for them would be the possibility to bring class actions instead of single cases in front of Austrian courts, and that is not possible at the moment. and also that Roma are included in the anti-discrimination institutions that exist in Austria on the federal but also on the state level. That would be, in the end, a proof that what we are talking about is not acts of charity, but that these are rights for Roma as individuals and as a group. And now I think that the brightest and lightest note of what I'm going to say, I now see a new generation of Romani activism in Austria. There are young people, as Gilda Horvath or Samuel Mago, who have managed to get their stories and their positive counter-narratives to the stereotypes into the mass media. I don't know if you know the magazine Vice. It's actually for young people that, and it's not even a high-level thing. You would not really think that a story about Roma would get in there, but Samuel, he just made it. And a lot of people read it and also asked me if I knew that this was there. And I said, well, yes, I've read it, and I think it's a good sign. But what would be necessary then in the end, if the European Union is honest about its modernist agenda in including Roma in societies, then it should at least be consequent in what it's doing and bring the infringement proceedings against Slovakia, Czech Republic, and Hungary in front of the Court of Justice of the European Union, because I think 3, 4, and 5 years respectively is enough waiting time already. Yes, so thanks, that would be.
Should I start? Okay. No, I don't have a presentation.
Oh, you don't have?
So thanks once again for having me here and for organizing this wonderful event. This was a very insightful event for me and thought-provoking as well. And as I'm not a scholar, I'm a legal practitioner from Serbia. I also hope that I will be able to live up with your academic expectations. So I've been working for the Belgrade Center for Human Rights for several years as a legal officer, providing free legal aid to asylum seekers coming to Serbia. And let me tell you first something about the Belgrade Center for Human Rights. It's one of most prominent maybe not. I would like to be humble, so it's one of.
It's well known.
It's a well-known NGO in Serbia, established in 1995 during Slobodan Milošević regime, in order to foster the rule of law and to improve the state of human rights back then. And it's an NGO that gathers different persons with different professional backgrounds, such as journalists, attorneys, economists, writers, teachers. And as this conference also does, we also strive to have like an interdisciplinary approach to the promotion of human rights. When it comes to the strategies that we undertake in this respect, we have we implement more or less classical strategies in terms of reporting on human rights abuses to UN treaty bodies. And we also compose yearly comprehensive report on the state of human rights in Serbia with a special focus on vulnerable groups. And what we also strive to do is to conduct strategic litigation before the European Court of Human Rights in some cases and before Serbian Constitutional Court as well, in order to urge our authorities to actually discharge their human rights obligations. Since 2012, we run this project jointly with UNHCR, with the support of the UNHCR, provision of free legal aid to asylum seekers in Serbia. And since working on this project, I have witnessed that the lack of political will of Serbian authorities to grant international protection to asylum seekers and also to integrate beneficiaries of international protection in Serbian societies. Strangely enough, Serbia, like other states in the Balkans, declared itself being a transit country, and thus it absolves itself from receiving actually refugees and from integrating them in the society. So basically all these countries along the Balkan route only facilitate onward migration of these people. And I mean, some of them are EU member states, but I also think this policy is implemented also in some Central European states as well. And the Serbian government enacted one very strange decree declaring all neighboring countries to Serbia safe third countries, which means that everybody who comes, any asylum seeker who comes to Serbia from these countries, that his asylum application will be dismissed on this basis. And we tried to contest the constitutionality of this decree, and our constitutional court stated that this is not a general act, and therefore it cannot question the constitutionality of this act. So we don't know what kind of act this is in legal terms, but it prevents many people from receiving international protection in Serbia. I would say that also people who obtained international protection in Serbia, they cannot be naturalized, they cannot receive Serbian citizenship because Serbian authorities don't recognize their residence permission. So they have some kind of sui generis residency, and thus they cannot qualify for Serbian citizenship. At the moment, the number of people who are granted refugee status or subsidiary protection in Serbia is not that big. There are maybe 70 people with this status, but since Hungary closed its border with Serbia, and introduced very restrictive measures in regard to refugee policy, we believe there are many people stranded in Serbia, and we believe that the number of people who will be in need for some kind of permanent protection, permanent integration will be higher. There is no overt, I would say that there is no overt racism in the political discourse in Serbia against asylum seekers and refugees, but the poor implementation of existing regulations actually manifests the very hostility towards these people. When it comes to other groups that are discriminated and segregated in Serbia, I would like to shed light on the situation of Roma people. In recent years, Serbia has introduced many action plans that some kind of soft law measures to tackle racism and discrimination. Some of these measures were even supported by EU in the light of EU accession process, but regrettably racism and segregation of Roma persist in Serbia. The Committee for the Rights of the Child expressed concern in 2017 over discrimination of Roma people in Serbia. Especially Roma children they have difficulties in accessing education, healthcare, and adequate housing. Additionally, the stigmatization of Roma people, and which sometimes results in violence and hate speech, is also persisting, and this was also restated by the Committee for the Rights of the Child. There are approximately 8,500 Roma people who are not registered at birth, and therefore they are legally invisible and stateless. This fact was also restated by UNHCR, who is trying to tackle this issue. In UNHCR's report from 2016, the main reasons for this situation of Roma people, some of these main reasons are listed as statelessness, forced displacement, and a lack of civil documentation and the inheritance of statelessness. However, it is a widespread view that Roma are indifferent actually to being undocumented, and that they are therefore partly responsible for this situation. And I think that this is a common view that many people share in Serbia. Whereas EU supports Serbia in tackling segregation of Roma and providing adequate housing. On the other hand, EU states consider Serbia a safe country, and therefore all Roma people seeking asylum in some EU member states have their claim being dismissed on this ground. Therefore, they are returned to Serbia, and they encounter, again, difficult problems to obtain personal documents, as we saw in the movie, and to exercise the right to social welfare and to work. In 2013, even, Serbia introduced in its criminal code the abuse of asylum system in EU as a criminal act, which means that people whose asylum claim was dismissed on this ground in EU member states can be penalized after coming back to Serbia. Also, Serbia introduced some kind of racial profiling at the border, which means that Serbian border police can prevent people from exiting the country on these unknown grounds, because there are some kind of unpublished directives within the Ministry of Interior that shape this practice. When it comes to remedies at the national level, I think that victims of racism and discrimination have limited access to the justice. Since Serbia did not enact the law regulating the free legal aid, many of these groups rely heavily on the support from NGOs. And indeed, there are some additional supplementary mechanisms, grievance mechanisms, such as Commissioner for the Protection of Equality and Ombudsperson are also mandated to entertain cases related to discrimination, but they cannot entertain these cases ex officio, and for this reason, I think, and in the light of this absence of free legal aid, many people cannot file complaints to these institutions. Additionally, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination stated in its concluding observations dating from January 2018 that hate crime and hate speech in general in Serbia remains underreported to these institutions, to the ombudsperson and to the Commissioner for the Elimination of, for the Protection of Equality. To my perception, the fact that the human rights are not integrated in formal curricula, educational curricula in Serbia, also perpetuates racism and discrimination. And we as a civil society organization, we strive to provide additional trainings and to educate lawyers and people with different professional background on about to give them additional education related to human rights. And we also undertook various project-based educational activities that target the different groups in 8 cities in Serbia, with the goal to familiarize these groups with the idea of human rights and to encourage them to contribute to the promotion of human rights in their communities. We also have one project related to hate speech on internet. It's called Anonymous Hatred, and somehow we strive to recognize this anonymous hatred and to improve existing grievance mechanisms. I think the awareness of this phenomenon is still not that big in Serbia, so it's underplayed somehow. Also, we try to develop some kind of artistic projects with youth, with Serbian youth. Recently, we had a project Out of the Box, which involves people, young people with different ethnical background. And the main tool of this project was a cultural package through which young people could also investigate and explore their own identity, but also what does diversity means to them. And through this cultural package, we managed to develop a theater play, which was staged in several cities in Serbia. And the play actually represented the grotesque reality these young people face. And actually, they had an opportunity to voice these deeply rooted stereotypes and to engage audience also to reply to these stereotypes. But yeah, just to conclude this, in general, yeah, we strive to include participants in our projects who reflect different racial, ethnic, or linguistic diversity, and to ensure cooperative and equal status role of these persons. And we try both to tackle individual and institutional sources of discrimination and racism. And in some projects we had sufficient support from state institutions, but in other projects we didn't. So yeah, there are many challenges before us.
So this has been such a rich opening of ideas that before we move to a collective discussion about next steps, I would like to invite some questions and answers from the crowd.
Just a quick question for Gregor. You mentioned Roma of Austria. So obviously, we have so many Roma from former Yugoslavia in Austria. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about them, because the last time I was in Austria was 2002, and I met with some reps from Eastern Europe, because I think the constitutionally recognized Austrian Roma, the population is much less than the migrant Roma families, or they've now been there for probably 3 generations or 4 generations or more.
Yeah, depends.
Depends.
Yeah. There are a lot of Roma from the Balkans that now live in Vienna and in other larger cities. Larger cities in Austria means Graz and yeah, what else? But as they don't have the status of the Austrian Romani population and are not represented in the council that's there for the Austrian Roma, they have relied on organizing themselves with NGOs, and there's the Romano Centro in Vienna that is supporting them with school counseling, additional teaching in German, but also in Romanes, and they are also trying to link up with the existing Austrian Roma initiatives. So it's not a, they get what I called before, they're not getting their rights, but they are getting acts of charity actually, and that has to change. And whether it's through an Austrian law or through EU law, I don't really care. One or the other, it has to be.
Just one thing, the Vienna City Council was pretty active at one point, where you remember the cultural mediators that.
Yeah.
So they had Romani cultural mediators at one time.
They're still in schools, yeah.
Yeah, is that still?
Yeah, it's still going on. And I think they have also raised the budget for that, because there are more children now in school that need to be taught Romanes or need extra lessons in German. So that's working out. On the other hand, longtime Mayor Michael Häupl of Vienna, he is going to retire, I think in May, next month. And afterwards, you don't know where the city council is going in what direction. It could also be the direction of the Freedom Party, and you can think what's happening then. For all the others that don't know the Austrian situation, the Freedom Party is an indirect successor of the National Socialist Party.
Other questions for the panelists?
I have a couple of questions for Lena. You had said something that asylum seekers that come to Serbia from surrounding states are returned because those countries are deemed safe. I just want to understand that. You're saying so asylum seekers from Hungary?
No,
or
no.
okay. So can you clarify that? And then I have a follow-up question, because you can't just ask one question, right?
I mean, these are asylum seekers coming from Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, but they come through the Balkan route, through the Western Balkan route, and all these states along this route are declared by Serbian government safe third states. So, and it happens now when also because Hungary declared Serbia a safe third state.
So then that leads to my next question.
Yeah.
So my question is, who's declaring these states safe first? So was it Germany declaring states safe first, or was it Serbia declaring second safe states? I mean, is it a sort of domino effect, or is it happening at the same time?
Serbia, I think that these states are trying to consolidate this policy somehow. But Serbia declared, and Germany declared Serbia a safe country of origin, whereas Serbia declared other countries safe third country, which means that people coming from refugee-producing countries, and if they pass through these safe third countries, they can't obtain asylum in Serbia. And Hungary also declared Serbia in 2015 safe third country, which means that if Syrian national goes through Macedonia, Serbia, and ends up in Hungary, he will be returned to Serbia because his asylum claim will be dismissed on this ground. And then Serbia will reconsider this claim and say, okay, you were in Hungary, and we consider Hungary safe third country, so this person will end up in a legal limbo, actually.
And if you indulge me, I have just one more question.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that you're saying that asylum is a very difficult case to prove in Serbia, which runs very contra to what the government was saying about themselves and producing this idea that we understand what it is to be refugees, we understand what it is to seek asylum, and therefore we will let people into our country very openly. So was there a time when asylum status was granted, or was it citizenship, or is that just a complete disconnect between what the leadership was saying and what was actually happening on the ground? And then I promise I won't ask you more questions.
I mean, in the course of this big influx of refugees in 2015, Serbian government was even praised by UNHCR and other international stakeholders of doing a great job. But actually, we were only facilitating their onward movement. It didn't provide any permanent solution, and this is what we are still doing. So we are doing a great job by using EU funds or UNHCR funds to facilitate onward migration, without having a genuine political will to accept these people. This is what is going on.
Did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you something. What do you think about, like in asylum law, when you think about the convention, and then this practice that countries declare each other safe, which should not be of any interest in an individual case where you have to see whether the reasons for fleeing are there for one person. So what do you make of that practice in the case of Serbia?
But this is like admissibility criteria.
Yeah.
This, if somebody from which
Okay.
country you come, and if you're, I mean, they don't consider it admissibility criteria, but it is actually. So if you don't meet these criteria, your application will be dismissed, and they will not decide on the merits of the case.
Okay.
Yeah,
The whole EU does it.
yeah, the whole EU does it.
That's what I wanted to know, whether it's
This
the
is like
same.
a very popular policy. Yeah.
Why should Serbia do any better than
Yes.
the European Union?
Yeah.
I just had a question for Eddie, because I think among the many disturbing things about the Jello case that I had heard, I think I had also heard that there was a defamation claim filed by German police against the activists
Yeah.
for raising these issues. So I was hoping you could say a little bit more about that and how it fits in with this general race aversion or denial within German culture.
Yeah, so that's actually also a real popular thing to do. And it comes up in various ways. So the police basically, in 2006, so this happened in 2005, by 2006 there was already the slogan, Uri Jello, das war Mord, so that was murder. And obviously it doesn't say who murdered, but the implication was that if police are going to be sued, they're going to be the ones who are on the receiving end of that. So that went before an administrative court judge in 2006, and the judge said, well, it's an open question, so it's actually a fair critique. It's not false, so it can't be a slander case. And that came back up in 2012, where the police, before one of the anniversary marches, said, you can't use that slogan tomorrow on placards, and if you do, we're going to take them from you. And that was kind of a warning to the activists, and they quickly wrote a press release, put it online, said, the police have told us this, we're going to use these posters, let's see this happens tomorrow. A judge has already said that this is okay. And they did, and the police forcibly removed the posters from people and really brutalized that. 3 activists wound up in the hospital, and one was knocked unconscious, and he's really the main person, Muktaba, who's running all of this. But I've talked to Cengiz about this other case, the racial profiling case, in which a man in Koblenz was on a train and he was racially profiled by police. And you know, he was frustrated because this happened to him 10 times in the past year. And he said, well, why are you asking me? And they said, well, you know, whatever. And then he said, well, this reminds me of something. And then, he's saying, this reminds me of the SS site. And then the police officer said, are you calling me a Nazi? And the guy said, well, no, but I'm saying this reminds me of something. So the police actually sued him with a Beleidigung, with like a personal defamation lawsuit. And so he had to countersue to say, well, but I was racially profiled. So this is kind of the freezing speech. There are other examples too, but it's a freezing speech technique.
That's the case where the police officer at the court admitted that they control on the basis of color.
Yeah.
And that was the basis for evidence to sue against the police and have this strong case of racial profiling.
So what happened?
Well, on appeals, the slander case was dropped because the court said that it is fair, it's a fair critique. Although the court said you were racially profiled, that's improper, but it left it open for further for this to happen again, and said, under similar circumstances, this could happen to you again, so just be aware. And the precedent system doesn't work in as clear a way as it would here. So.
I'm not sure whether it opens up to the broader discussion on remedies, and somehow you get the feeling that everything needs to, like whether it's pedagogy, lobbying, changing courts, and various mechanisms that the question is then which one will get prioritized in certain ways, and I guess these are some of the choices that will need to be made, but specifically I think also critical race theorists have highlighted or critiqued the role of courts, and that we focused here in the US a lot on courts, and actually maybe the legislator might be one of them. I mean, that was those days. But the question to the panel that I have is more specifically on, all of you mentioned the European Court of Human Rights as one of the venues, but how do you see that in a changing political climate, the judges that are going to be elected they're elected nationally, and so with the national politics changing dramatically, how open is that? The court has not done very well on issues that we're talking about, racist violence, so they've been not the best institution either. And on top of that, some of the issues that come up with a changing political climate, and the judges are very aware of that. And there's rifts within that court where the judges that we're really seeing the court as a human rights watchdog are in the minority at this point. So how open is that venue even though it seems to be? I mean, I'm not saying don't try it, but we need to be realistic as well about when we start thinking about the remedies and which one to prioritize, whether that one is still, in the next years, in the future years, really a realistic kind of venue to bring those kind of claims for racial minorities and for racial justice.
Yeah, well, first I thought you would say, which of those goals should we prioritize in the global revolution? but then, yeah, you came back to the facts. I think that the European Court of Human Rights has even harsher problems at the moment with Russia defunding the Council of Europe, and with the backlog of cases that it still has, that has gotten smaller. But when there's oppression issues coming up, people are still waiting, I don't know, 15 years after the incident to get their judgment passed there, 20 even. So in the end, we are going now to have to think about alternative ways. And then again, when you think about the Court of Justice of the European Union, you don't have a subjective right to get there even. So I think the Commission has to get active as the guardian of the treaties. And when then Mr. Orban rebels against that, yeah, well, maybe he's in the wrong union.
Yeah.
Maybe I would like to get very technical with respect to the question of remedies. I think for a legal practitioner or for legal scholars, and linking that to Eddie's case, I think the burden of proof might be something where we really should work on an empirical evidence. So if we cannot talk about race, we don't have racial data. If we don't have racial data, for instance, if we would have racial data in Eddie's case, we could make the claim as a potential racial discrimination, because that's not the claim yet, right? The claim is still that in custody. And we could make the point that black people in the eastern part of Germany are endangered, that there is harassment with respect to black people. They have their own organizations where they declare zones as no-go areas. Other people of color have been complaining about this. And as long as official statistics do not exist, I think it's going to be very, very hard for us to do that. And I know I know a couple of NGOs who are doing this, try to do that, to collect the racial and ethnic data, and also monitoring anti-Muslim racism or harassments towards Muslims. And I have to say, it's very pity, but in the German context, it seems to be that there is a high sensitivity against anti-Semitic crimes, but not to other racial crimes, and that's part of, I think, German exceptionalism, where then the Jewish exceptionalism derives of, which means actually, like, you have in the German context a sort of more privileged victims. It's sad to say that, but empirical evidence shows that, and since yesterday or 2 days ago, we have at the level of chancellor a new office for anti-Semitism. So only for anti-Semitism and an official office, it's like at the highest official political level. So I think empirical evidence is very important for us.
I guess I was just going to ask if we were puzzling a little bit yesterday over the movie and the circumstance of the brothers in the movie, and trying to understand what was this arrangement between Germany in the first instance that caused them to be expelled. And so it's kind of a technical question, but I think it actually is germane to what you were talking about how the different countries are utilizing the declaration of other spaces as safe countries as a way of sort of shifting off responsibility. So it was particularly curious because I believe this was 2010 when this, right? So
I will tell you. This is a very interesting thing, indeed. So, within this EU accession process, Serbia had to sign like a stabilization and association agreement with EU, which actually obliged Serbia to ratify and to sign first and to ratify readmission agreement with EU, meaning that Serbia will accept all former refugees in EU member states from Kosovo. And these brothers were, I suppose that they came to Germany.
But one was born in Germany.
Yes, maybe their parents even came to Germany as refugees, but in accordance with this readmission agreement, Serbia is obliged to receive these people back.
But not the parents.
It was not sure. It was not clear to me how the mother managed to stay there. So
How did they determine who?
I think it is just a very specific thing of how Germany proceeds with foreigners who offend, who just are involved in a criminal act. We know cases that went to the European Court of Human Rights where Turkish citizens born in Germany were expelled because they got they got in a criminal life.
So it's the allegations of the criminal behavior that become the basis for selecting.
In my reading, that was the legal context.
but basically
Well,
there's
one of them said he was not implicated in anything at all.
Because he didn't do anything anymore after he entered Germany. I assume. The one who,
No, before, like the first time, yeah, the,
One of them had been involved in selling weed,
yeah.
but the other one was working and said
he had no back, no
he had no
history.
background.
Can I back up on
Oh.
one of the things that you just said? You just said a Turkish citizen born in Germany, which I think is probably really important to understand, that just because you're
Yeah.
born in Germany doesn't make you a German citizen.
Yeah, we got,
Right.
yeah,
So-
we're all
But I think that is one of the fundamental disconnects of understanding the film. And the fact that you framed it that way, that you're a Turkish citizen born in Germany, means that these individuals are Kosovar citizens born in Germany.
No, I get there's
Yeah.
no birthright citizenship. I
Yeah.
was just confused as
Meanwhile,
to
there is, yeah.
which, because all of the people in that family
Yeah.
fall into that category.
Right, right.
And only some of them were expelled. So that's what I was trying to
I
understand.
see.
So as I understood in legal terms, like under this agreement that Serbia signed with EU, refugee status of these persons was revoked and they had to return to Serbia. But if they managed to regulate their stay in Serbia under employment agreement or whatever, like if they managed to obtain,
It's like probation.
it's a kind of probation, but if they have like other legal ground to stay there, they can stay under this Duldung status, yeah.
I just want to pick on something you said, and it was really important, I think, your point earlier. It seems to me, because I'm coming back into Romani studies after a hiatus in India after a long time, and it seems to me that what I'm seeing now, what I'm hearing here today, is that things are getting really tough at the national level in terms of laws and legislation and politics. And so, for example, in Hungary, 2010, the 3 strikes, and you're criminalized, you're in that category of, recidivist, hardened criminal, whatever, and you've just committed, 3 crimes. That's come back in 2010. There's a disproportionate impact on Roma because of that law. And then what you just described in Serbia, which is trying to, trying to meet all these requirements and getting into an EU, which fundamentally might be, falling out at the seams or cracking, I don't know exactly what's happening, or it's not that bad, it's not that dire, but there's a lot of warning signs here going on. So it just seems to me that the lives, the everyday life of an ordinary Romani person in Europe is probably just, seems to me, getting worse, at the national level, as the politics of the right is taking over. Now, I don't know what's going on in France. Macron makes all these promises. He was supposed to roll back the xenophobia that had happened, whatever it was it 2012 and onwards, with the Bulgarian and Romanian Roma that were, considered non-EU somehow, even though they had every legal right to stay, So I don't know what Macron's new politics is about, but I don't know if you can just broadly address this question of what's happened in the last maybe 7 years or so in Europe in general.
When are you planning to leave here?
We can talk about it after the cocktail.
For me, it's personally very disappointing that it seems that there are no mechanisms within EU to tackle these authoritarian regimes. And for instance, Serbia and Turkey are candidates to the membership. They all have very authoritarian regimes, and EU is supporting these, ruling political parties and continues this EU accession negotiations. And it seems that this EU process legitimizes these authorities, actually. And for me, this is very disappointing.
Yeah, and it was pretty widely accepted that the expulsion of Romani people who were citizens of EU countries was blatantly a violation of citizenship rights and the race directive under EU law.
Yes.
The Commission came out and said it, but then there wasn't really a good follow-up mechanism to bring France or Italy in line.
French changed the thing and just took out the word nomad, and
Yeah.
then it was fine for the commission. Then it wasn't racial anymore, and that was fine. That was in 2012 or something like that.
Always
And
good to
my
be a
goals
founding
policies
member.
haven't really changed. They didn't change. I mean, now between Italy and France on the borders, there's been a lot of discussion because the French border police have been basically violently pushing certain migrants, refugees, potential refugees at the borders, and 2 of them were actually pregnant women, lost their kids, and so there's been a lot of Macron's policies didn't change anything, which isn't surprising, quite frankly. It's not like he's the angel and before it was all bad. I mean, the left and sort of liberal left, socialist and sort of right wing have been doing the similar policies in this domain, so there's not a lot of change. Calais has been there the same way, so I don't see macroscopic changes with that specific political situation in France.
As I've said yesterday in the lecture, I think every political denomination that we've ever had in Europe has failed Roma people until now.
I just have a very brief comment. So most of what you all are focusing on are in many ways are sort of legal. And I would just like to introduce here that I think that the film that we watched yesterday and the work that Angela and also Aniko and Valerie as well are engaged in present the possibility of a different type of remedy where we're changing images and we're challenging images and we're pushing back on images. And that I think, has to go in tandem with some of these legal structures and political structures that we're talking about. So if we look to the last panel on some level, I think we can start to maybe have that enter into our dialogue about understandings of remedies as well. So that's all.
I would harken back to the prior panel on social movements,
That as well, yes.
because we have at least some evidence, and it may not work in Europe when you have these stop and frisk policies and other things being popped up with no rationale behind them. You know, the cop watch movement here, it's got some risks, but they really are documenting, they're providing real-time, right now data, right? And so the people are becoming the researchers, right? One of the projects that we're working on here is to work with the highly policed community, members of that community, to marry their already well-developed community organizing skill with research skills, so that and they've asked for this. This is their project. They defined the agenda. We're just pitching in to help out, right? So they can marry community organizing and data capacity to drive sustainable change. So that it may be hopeless also, but.
I want to add to that, and I just want to quote Alicia Garza, who I think has a great quote when she said, "There's absolutely no substitute for grassroots organizing." But here's the other thing that I want to put on top of that we haven't quite discussed today, that I think, or we have in Angela's talk to some degree. But I am struck by a person who runs a study abroad program in Berlin, in Germany, and the ways in which the academic structure, power structure, is kind of circa 1950, right? And so when I was in law school, I, along with other, students across the country, we made it our mission to make sure that our law faculty didn't just have one spec or two, whether it was gender, race, sexuality, disability, whatever, right? But that's essentially what every law faculty in the top 50 looked like, right? It has changed in a few decades, but it's still like that in much of Europe. And I think if we take the work of Christy Dotson seriously, who's a Black feminist epistemologist, who talks about hermeneutical injustice and the ways in which structures of power and knowledge prevent communities from being able to understand their own subjugation because of that knowledge lockout, I think there is a connection there between the academic lockout and, grassroots organizing. Because we have got brilliant people, as you can see here today from this conversation, in Europe that are not in positions, right, in academia. So that is one of a high priority thing that I think we need to talk about and think about.
There's something I want to pick up on this, what you said. So there's a discussion right now about introducing critical social justice concepts, or not introducing, but having a dialogue actually with grassroots activists in Eastern Europe And one of the people involved said, well, we can't use the word neoliberalism because most of the activists don't actually know, what does it mean? What does neoliberalism mean? This is not. So then somebody suggested, let's just use the term current economic system. Current economic system. So those are the kinds of discussions that are happening right now on the ground, is how we actually articulating sort of these strategies for, empowerment at some level, so that kind of thing.
So we have a few more minutes to chat together, and I think we're all eager to share ideas about next steps. This has been tremendously productive. So grateful to this panel. So let's give this panel another round. Sumi, you've made an outstanding point about critical foundations for next steps. We're not going to make next steps without those kinds of foundations.
There's brilliant people in this room who need to be hired.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, Sumi, I think you touched on something that's really significant with regards to just institutions in Germany in terms of what diversity means. And Mateus, we were also talking about diversity in Germany isn't sort of ethnic or racial diversity. It's sort of gender. And it's also part of the work that I think Black German activists and also Turkish German activists are engaging in, is that they're outside of these sort of institutions, but they're still creating and producing knowledge and disseminating that knowledge. And I think there was an effort by a white academic in Bremen a couple years ago to create this Black knowledge program that totally was problematic. So they were requesting EU funds and did not engage with anyone from the Black German community. So it's just we're creating Black knowledge with no Black people. And so, the Black German community wrote a letter and, were very adamant about why this is problematic. But this also continued to sort of, represent what was problematic about German academia more broadly. This is not. And there's also a Black diaspora network that I think they were critiqued, and then they invited Black German scholars to participate to be a part of it as network members. So it seems like these are sort of longer issues within German academia, in which how do we create more spaces for scholars of color? How do we sort of really break down this sort of binary of sort of community activists versus intellectual academic? You guys can also
just from there. That's some. You really touched upon something very important, and it's something very clear. What you can observe very clear in the German context. I started to call it, and I'm actually writing something about that, diversity without race. That's actually what happens in Germany. So just 2 days ago, I got an email in my inbox, a job posting. I didn't know that there is a quite high-profile Center for Integration and Migration now just installed. They pay very well, and then they are looking for 3 leading positions. And if you read the job description, it's insane that it's obviously it is a center for a scientific center for academic center for migration and integration studies, and it literally says the regular and usual sentence of women are highly encouraged to apply. And for disabled person, if you have equal qualification, you are given preference.
Discriminate against you.
And there is not even any sentence we have proxies like people with migration backgrounds. Let's say we find it okay. Even that is not included in the job description, and that just happened 2 days ago.
Yeah, we have a lot of diversity without race here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in some ways one of the difficulties as well, this goes also in the types of academic courses that we're allowed to teach. The European model is mainland European model is based on this government sort of controlled, and it takes much longer time to, so you cannot just create a course and next year I put it on, you know, I can teach it. You can do it for smaller seminar kind of workshop type of things, but having that and changing the curriculum takes an enormous time. So there is that additional rigidity that you see on top, because these are, except for the private universities, but the public ones, which is where in France, Germany, Italy, certainly Spain, probably, that's where the majority of the education takes place. You have these very rigid kind of situations where you can't just like, you know, sit together, Cengiz and I want to teach a course next year and we do it, we propose and that's it. I mean, I may be oversimplifying things, and this is not exactly the way that it happens in the US either, but in some ways there's an incredible amount of rigidity there that then prevents the kind of knowledge production and developing new curricula and courses that are adapted to the new needs. And so that maybe explains why Angela and I are, you know, probably teaching on the mainland European context of one course on critical race theory. We're in a private university where we can do this kind of work, and so offering it on a regular basis as an offered course, not in a summer school kind of setting or in a smaller seminar kind of setting. But then again, these are other structures in changing the academic world or environment that we're working and living in, sort of.
Well, we've sort of bumped up against the end of our scheduled time, so I think we can continue the conversation over this lovely stuff for the reception. Felix, you want to take it from here?
Thank you. I just wanted to conclude by recognizing people who would otherwise be overlooked. The first thing I wanted to say was that this was truly a collaborative effort. And so I've got a long list of people to thank, so I'll keep it short because I know I stand between you and wine and hors d'oeuvres. But there was actually a planning and organizing committee that did this, and I'm going to name them. So the first is Jenny Edelstein, and thank you, Jenny. She's really the unsung hero. I mean, Jenny did everything from making sure that registration happened without a glitch, to uploading all your papers on Dropbox, to ordering all the food. Sherry English, who did the marketing. Emily Ho, Kristen Calsum, Janet Moore, Sunny Rucker Chang. Thank you to Katie Gaines, Olivia Lawson, and the other fellows of the Center for Race, Gender, and Social Justice at the College of Law for helping out with logistics. Thank you, Mike Mims, for ensuring that this is preserved for posterity. Elaine Dunkler, who's not here, for coordinating funding. Nikki Moore Hawkins and the staff at the African American Culture and Resource Center for allowing us to have this event here. School of Social Work for providing linens. They're sponsors. So there's a long list of sponsors, and we got
the drill guy for stopping.
Yeah, right. That's right. Yeah. This project received a lot of buy-in at the university, so there were many different units, and we already have a list of the funders, but I just wanted to name them again: the Center for Race, Gender, and Social Justice, the College of Law, College of Arts and Sciences, European Studies Program, the Fellows of the Graduate School at the University of Cincinnati, the German Studies Department, the Office of Equity and Inclusion. And there were various units at the Taft Research Center, including the Visual Media Studies Group, the Global Studies Group, and the Human Rights Group. So thank you to all our funders. Thank you, finally, to all the presenters, moderators, to Cheryl, the keynote speaker, and to the audience, many of whom traveled from far and wide, and students who came without being offered extra credit. Thank you.